Hey everyone, this is Rose Daly, the City Sustainability Coordinator of Sun Prairie, and you're listening to the Sustainable Sun Prairie podcast, the show that aspires to educate, empower, and engage our listeners in all aspects of sustainability. Whether you are a seasoned sustainability enthusiast or just beginning your sustainability journey, each episode will have something new and exciting for everyone. Let's begin the conversation for a greener community. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. So in the United States, we actually live in a world that is built for passenger vehicles. We have thousands of miles of expansive roadways that reach almost every corner of our country. And this is convenient for us because it allows us to travel to destinations quickly. However, these highways and freeways are continuing to expand, and that's through the addition of more lanes or lengthening the reach of the road to other parts of our country. And something interesting I found is that in Houston, Texas, there is a freeway named the Katy Freeway that spans across 26 lanes, making it the nation's widest freeway. In addition to this, our neighborhoods and towns are sprawled, leaving us no choice but to use vehicles to get from home to work or to the store. The majority of us, unfortunately, don't live in a location that makes alternative modes of transportation feasible, such as biking or taking public transit. Now, what does all this mean in terms of sustainability? According to the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, the United States transportation sector accounts for 29%, or nearly 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions. If we break down this transportation category, we can see that 12% of the greenhouse gases are emitted by airlines, 20% are emitted by freight and trucks, and a whopping 57% of transportation emissions come from passenger vehicles. And these are going to be, of course, your standard cars or SUVs that all of us own. So clearly, car transportation is a major driver of climate change here in the US. If we're able to remove passenger vehicles from our roadways, this will drive down emissions, result in reduced road congestion, increase the life of our roadways, and also increase safety. So there's a lot of benefits there. We can strategically reduce car transportation by introducing public transit options such as buses, rideshare services, and trains, which have been shown to produce significantly lower greenhouse gas emissions compared to passenger vehicles. These options, of course, still allow us to get to our destination, but they're overall better for the environment. So with all that being said, in this episode, we are going to have a conversation about public transit. We'll look at public transit options available in Sun Prairie, discuss the up-and-coming bus rapid transit system, or BRT, that is becoming popularized in the US, and we're going to determine if public transit does in fact advance the triple bottom line of sustainability. We'll also dive into what our future roads will look like. And spoiler, they are not going to keep expanding like the Katy Freeway in Texas. Now, joining me here today is Alexander Brown. He is the transportation coordinator for the city of Sun Prairie, and he has served in this role for the past 2.5 years. So he works on everything transportation related for the city, everything from biking trails, bike infrastructure, and our public transit systems. Welcome, Alexander.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. It's finally warming up outside. How are you?
Yeah, it's like a nice 11 degrees out.
Nice and balmy.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's a little bit nicer out. So I am really looking forward to our conversation today. And I thought a good place to start is just to look at our little local environment here. I want to better understand what public transit options we currently have in Sun Prairie.
Absolutely. So for public transit here in Sun Prairie, we are served by Metro Transit, which is the regional bus system for Madison, which also serves, of course, our neighboring suburbs of Middleton and Fitchburg and Monona recently. So currently here in Sun Prairie, we have 2 local circulator routes throughout the city, as well as one regular route from our park and ride that goes into Madison 7 days a week, running roughly about every half hour.
Okay, that's awesome. I'm happy to hear we do have some public transit here. When did this come about? Like, how did we get to where we are today? Was there kind of a progression in our public transit? Like, did we start somewhere, or is this kind of our first step?
Very much so, and this is a pretty dramatic change for where Sun Prairie has been in recent history. So, as you know, as I'm sure most of your listeners probably know, Sun Prairie continues to be, to this day, one of the fastest growing communities in Wisconsin. It wasn't that long ago that this was a much smaller community, and as such, Sun Prairie had a publicly subsidized shared ride taxi system. This was a system that was publicly subsidized by the city. That was a demand service, so kind of like a typical private taxi system, except that the average fares were a bit cheaper, so more in line of kind of what we see for public transit systems. As the city grew to the size that it is today of about 39,000 and became in some ways a functional suburb of Madison, there became a lot more talk within the community and in city committees and commissions, particularly our transit commission, about the importance of having a more formalized fixed route public transit system.
Okay.
One thing that came, and that started to come about eventually in 2019 when we introduced our first Metro Transit route, back when the routes were by numbers. That was called Route 23. That was a commuter service route that ran from the Capitol to the Park and Ride and served the Prairie Lakes area as well. That ran about three times in the morning and 3 times in the afternoon during those peak commute hours for the longest time. Obviously, of course, the pandemic hit, and that affected public transit in all sorts of ways. That was no exception here in Sun Prairie. And that not only affected public transit, that affected transportation in general, including the taxi industry, including our shared ride taxi. And this was a perfect, unfortunate storm of events here. Obviously, we had lower ridership across the board for the entire section. You may also recall that there were labor shortages across all industries, and this hit the taxi industry and transportation industry particularly hard.
Right, I bet.
Yeah. And while it was already in the dialogue to start planning for local service here in Sun Prairie to kind of like what we see today with the full-time service, it became clear, and it was part of the Transit Commission's purview, that there was an added sense of urgency here as we were having multiple instances because of all these challenges of the service that we had with the shared ride taxi not being able to meet hours consistently. So whenever we have a situation where people are ordering rides and those rides are not coming or those rides cannot be unreliable, it was contingent for us to do something. So that led to, and we'll talk about this more later, but where eventually we piggybacked on to the City of Madison's redesign for their transit system and kicked off the full-time service we have today last June.
Oh, okay. So we kind of had this natural progression from a taxi to a local transit system, but the pandemic catalyzed that.
Exactly. That really exacerbated a lot of the problems that we saw.
Okay, so it sounds like our system has been in service for about 6 months now. Can you share some information regarding ridership?
Yeah, absolutely. So we get information roughly on a monthly basis from Metro Transit as to how all of our routes are doing. Certainly when this went before the city council, and obviously council asked kind of how we would determine whether or not this would be successful. One thing that is less important than an actual number is to look at the trend in ridership. Are we seeing a consistent rise from a month-to-month basis? That will be the ultimate signal to us as to whether or not this is successful. One thing I'm very happy to say is that since June 11th, consistently without fail, from month to month, ridership has been growing in a very big way. The latest numbers we happen to have right now are from November, but just between July and November, those numbers almost doubled.
Wow.
So at least an 80% increase. So just for reference, on routes S and W, we had roughly 1,400 boardings in July.
So we're talking thousands of people
Yeah.
per month. Wow.
And then by November, that went up to about 2,500, and it looks like that's continuing to rise. Keep in mind, of course, that this does not include the rides of many people at the Park and Ride who are transferring on to Route A, which is the route that goes into Madison. And last time we got stop-level data, that accounted for about a third of rides taken within Sun Prairie. So it's really reasonable that number to this day is really more like 3,300 or 3,400.
Okay.
Just doing some back-of-the-envelope math here.
Gotcha. So we have like a conservative estimate, but we should anticipate higher numbers.
Exactly. And of course, this does not account for people transferring in the bus, for example, when they're coming into Madison and staying on the bus to go into Sun Prairie. Those numbers aren't counted as well.
Okay. I see.
So the numbers we have here are really the most conservative estimate, but the reality is that it's significantly higher.
Okay, that's awesome. Because I was curious myself if it was hundreds of people or thousands of people, but to me it sounds like our transit system is pretty successful. Do you anticipate the trends ever plateauing or becoming more stable than the continuing increase?
There probably will be a certain level of plateauing, and certainly part of what's going on here, and this was kind of shown from Metro Transit and generally transit system experiences from introducing transit to a new area, is that takes roughly 2 years, not to a digit, but roughly 2 years for those numbers to be really baked in. And that's partly because people are familiarizing themselves with the route. Obviously, a lot of my day-to-day work is still just helping to get Sun Prairie familiar with taking the bus. Some of those questions about, how do I get on the bus? How do I wait for the bus? How do I get off the bus?
Right.
That can take a few years. And so obviously the trend that we're seeing right now is going pretty high, but eventually someday that will become a little bit more of a flat line and then fall more in the trend of what we would see for the Metro Transit system in general.
Okay. And I totally get that with the 2-year baked in time. I know people can be really hesitant about riding the bus. I know I used to be because I was like, well, how do I pay for it? Is it cash? Is it card? Like, where are the bus stops? How long will it take to get to my destination? So I'm happy to hear that you're continuing to push out that information to our residents.
Absolutely.
So what would you say is the overall value of this new transit system for our city?
The overall value is can be described in a few ways. For one, and I think really the biggest one, is that this is really the first time that here in Sun Prairie that we've had a 7-day-a-week option for any sort of utilitarian or commute travel other than single occupancy vehicle that's in any way realistic.
Okay.
Our shared ride taxi system, when it existed, did have some special shuttles that went out to East Town Mall, but that's about it. And this is something that kind of happens every half hour, 7 days a week. And for a community like Sun Prairie, where the vast majority of people, when they commute, are really commuting out of town, mostly to Madison, that really is a game changer in the long term. And I know you'll be talking a little bit more about this lately, but that can really start to affect the pocketbook when you're someone who decides to transition from driving your own vehicle into and out from Madison every day to maybe taking public transit every day.
Yeah, so true. This is such a huge improvement for our city. So you had kind of mentioned that we have 2 routes right now for our public transit. I think you said W and S.
Yep.
So these routes, you said, do travel to Madison, and how often do they make stops along that route?
Sure. So routes S and W are 2 circulator routes that loop around the city. They themselves don't go into Madison, but they all meet at the park and ride with Route A, which does go into Madison.
Okay,
that Route A being the future bus rapid transit route, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later here.
Yes.
But so Route W and S are what we call, one is a ridership route and one is a coverage route. Route W does a shorter loop within central Sun Prairie, so for anyone here who's listening who's familiar with the area, it starts at the park and ride, goes up through Prairie Lakes, loops onto the interstate to go over sort of to the intersection of Bird and Windsor, hitting up some of the housing up there. There's like an Ace Hardware, Dunkin' Donuts, a few other grocery stores up there, looping back down around West Main Street along that main commercial corridor and looping down to O'Keefe. It makes that circle every half hour from 6 to 6 on weekdays.
Okay.
So that is kind of what we call a ridership route because it is more frequent. It's a bit more convenient, and we see a little bit more frequent ridership on that route. Route S is what we call a coverage route. That one runs every hour, but runs a much bigger circle throughout the city, so a lot more people could technically take it. That one starts at the park and ride, heads up O'Keefe, down Main Street where it goes to our downtown, loops back up onto Bristol Street until we get to the edge of the business park, loops over onto Tower, and then heads back down south past the Vandenberg Heights neighborhood, past the Pack, and then onto Windsor Street, going over to Grand Avenue, and then serving that entire commercial corridor, going past West High School, through Prairie Lakes until it comes back to the park and ride. So again, that one runs every 60 minutes, but that one covers much more of the city.
Okay, wow. You have the whole route memorized. I love that. For anyone who's not from Sun Prairie, feel free to jump into a map and you can try to trace the route yourselves. Otherwise, I think we do have maps available, right, on our website?
We do.
Okay.
Absolutely, and just a little plug for anyone who is interested in riding the bus. There are two ways in which you can plot what your potential route would look like. You can either go into Google Maps and just pull up directions, just like you would for your car, but you press the little bus icon, and you can get it done that way. Metro Transit also encourages people to use the Transit app. It's literally an app in the App Store just called Transit, which works in a similar way too, and that has real-time tracking information in case we're running into some issues like we had in the past week where icy roads might cause traffic delays, so that you're not sitting there wondering where the bus is. You know exactly when it will come and exactly when it will get you to your destination.
Okay, that's awesome. It sounds like we just have a ton of information available to make this really easy for people.
Absolutely.
I think another question I have is, what is the cost of the bus? Because that's often something else people ask about, and how do you actually pay for your pass?
Absolutely. So there's a few options, but the main fare, if you're just a person walking onto the bus, is $2 a fare. And that can be paid currently, and that will change probably by the end of the year here. But currently it's either by cash or you have a bunch of different pass options that you can buy. Those can be 10 ride passes or 31-day passes, etc. And I would encourage people to visit the city website and visit our FAQs to see more about what your options there. There is $1 fare for seniors and people with disabilities to ride the bus as well.
Okay, great. And I'm assuming those passes have to be bought in advance through the website?
Yes,
okay.
At this point.
Okay, awesome.
At the website, or here in Sun Prairie, they can also be bought at the front desk. At City Hall, at the Public Library, where we're recording here, of course, and at the Westside Community Center.
Okay, that's awesome. How about I drop the website link in the show notes so people can just easily navigate to our Metro Transit page?
Perfect.
Okay, sweet. So I kind of want to zoom out a little bit. We've talked about the details of the system, how people can begin riding it, where the routes go. But what would you say are the major pros and cons of this system? And are there any barriers you see to our current transit?
Of course. I think the pros, and really, I think really the whole story to this is that this is a vast improvement in terms of public access and affordable access to transportation other than a car from what has existed previously in Sun Prairie. It's really a game changer for the city. Coverage is broad, and it is reliable. Obviously, that reliability depends somewhat as to where in the city you are located. But it is overall quite reliable. There's never you're never in any guess as to whether the bus is going to come on the half hour. Of course, if we're running into weather situations like we are lately, maybe it is 5 minutes late, but it's going to show up. And I think what the cons are for the system is that at this point, we could use more. In order to make this system work seamlessly, and to make it financially feasible, this was essentially as revenue neutral an option as possible to make the switch from the shared ride taxi system that we had previously to the bus. So at this point, what we have right now is that, like I referred to earlier, depending where you are in the city, transit can be extremely reliable and extremely convenient. It's always reliable depending where you are in the city, but it's maybe not always as convenient. That is, if you're living on some of the peripheries and you just have to wait on Route S, and depending where you want to get in Madison, that could still be a long trip. Okay. And of course, another part of this is that paratransit service. And by paratransit, for listeners, what we mean too is that when we talk about Metro Transit, this is technically two services. What we're talking about, in this show for the most part, is the fixed route bus, the vehicle that we see, every day going past the bus stops. But from the Americans with Disabilities Act that was passed, Metro Transit and transit agencies across the country also have to provide door-to-door rideshare service for anyone living within 0.75 miles of those fixed route transit corridors who cannot make it to or from a bus stop of their own accord. And again, that service is really dictated by those corridors. So we would love to push that out eventually, have more fixed route service here in Sun Prairie, both just for the convenience of the fixed route service itself, but to broaden out that buffer to cover 100% of the city. So again, we are very close to that right now, but we'd like to kind of push to get that from what's essentially right now about 95, 96% coverage to 100% coverage.
Okay, yeah, I was going to ask about our current percentage. Honestly, that's not bad, but I do see the value of getting to 100%. Do you think that could be fixed by adding additional routes or adjusting the routes that we have?
It could. Certainly, when you're talking about modifying a route, what ultimately dictates those is time. One of the reasons why drawing these routes was so tricky is because when you want to bring service to one area, that's great, but it has to fit within a certain time domain, and it has to get back to the park and ride to transfer over to Madison in a pretty reasonable amount of time. So there can be sort of the uncomfortable question where, okay, so I'm just using this as an example. If we get closer to the business park, that's fine, but then who do we have to cut out service to in order to make that timing work?
I see.
So it's really a calculus there. So really, for the good of the city, it would be better for us to add more routes.
Okay.
So I think a good example here is we're much more new to the game here than some of our other peer suburbs like Fitchburg and Middleton. But for perspective, we put about 550 to 600,000 per year purely in local money to public transit. Fitchburg and Middleton are really putting something more like 1.1 million. Wow. So that's about double what we're doing for what are both smaller cities than Sun Prairie.
Okay.
So we have a bit more ground to cover to maybe get that comparable level of service.
Yeah, sounds like we have to catch up to our neighbors. So since we're kind of talking about finances right now, I wanted to go back to talking about the financial benefit of our transit system as compared to driving a personal vehicle. Because as you had said, bus fares range from $1 to $2. They might even become cheaper if you buy that bulk pass package. So I did a little bit of digging into the financial benefit, and what I found is that according to the American Public Transportation Association's Transit Savings Report, I don't know if you've come across that, but they suggest that taking public transit instead of driving a personal vehicle can save close to $13,000 annually. And at first I was like, wait, that's way too much money because I don't think I spend that much on my car. But this includes filling up your gas tank, oil changes, maintenance, and your monthly car payment. So if you do have those payments, then that's going to add up to over $10,000 for you. Now, I do know that car costs vary significantly across our country, so I looked for Wisconsin-specific data, and I actually found that Wisconsinites, on average, are spending about $10,000 per year on their personal vehicles. And this was data that was reported by TMJ4 in 2023, so pretty relevant. So what this tells me is that there clearly are some financial benefits to taking advantage of public transit systems, but what I'm most interested in are actually the environmental benefits. Before I get into that, though, do you have any comments on the personal vehicle cost versus the transit system?
Certainly, that savings is probably even more than I would have guessed off the top of my head.
Yeah, I was pretty shocked as well.
Certainly when looking outside, how many people are probably going to their auto shops and getting winter tires and such like that. I can see how that could add up quickly.
Yeah, I guess just thinking about numbers, and I'm just going to do this off the top of my head, but if you're spending, let's say, $2 a day, you're taking the bus 5 days a week to go to work, let's say, so $10 a week you're paying for the bus, and then 52 weeks in a year, $520 to transport yourself to work, as opposed to a couple thousand you would spend on your vehicle. And I know we probably can't use transit for everything right now. People probably have to drive out of Dane County, or they need to get somewhere very quickly sometimes, so people are still probably going to be using personal vehicles, but there's still going to be a significant cost savings there if you can transition some of your transportation over to public transit.
Certainly.
All right, so now I want to jump into environmental benefits because that's my true passion, right?
Certainly.
So when we think about emissions of buses over cars, the first thing to point out is that personal vehicles do achieve much better gas mileage than buses. Obviously, right? Vehicles are smaller, they weigh less, and they're built to have higher efficiencies per federal guidelines for car manufacturers. Now, in terms of real numbers, we're talking about the average personal vehicle achieving approximately 21 miles per gallon, whereas a bus might achieve 3 to 4 miles per gallon. They're also making probably more frequent stops than vehicles would, but of course that depends on where you are within the city. Now, I think what's important to point out, though, is that even though buses have worse gas mileage, they're able to carry many more people, of course, than just a passenger vehicle. And this is the most important factor in determining emission levels for the buses. So if we instead look at emissions in terms of passenger miles, like emissions per passenger mile, as opposed to emissions per gallon of fuel burned, then we're able to see how much more efficient public transit is. So according to the Federal Transit Administration of the U.S. Department of Transportation, bus transit produces 33% less CO2 emissions than the average personal vehicle. Now, this number is specific to a bus that has only a quarter of its seats filled. So even though it's not at its full capacity, it's still reducing emissions. Now, if instead all bus seats are filled, it's at 100% capacity, the emission savings jumps to 82%, which is huge. So that's kind of like the average data for our country. I, again, wanted to bring this back to our local data. So I kind of did a back of the napkin calculation based on the numbers you gave us for the average ridership, and then also like the average commute in this area, which is about 20 miles. So based on all of that, I pulled some data from the National Transit Database so I could look at efficiency of our buses, and I determined that our public transit system releases 36% less emissions than if the individuals who rode that bus instead drove a personal vehicle. So I think this tells us that our numbers are very close to the national average. And again, if we are able to see full capacity in our buses or our transit systems, then we will see that number jump up significantly.
I would imagine so, and probably even more so because, as you might know, Metro Transit is making the move to make its fleet all electric, and quite a bit of its fleet already right now is electric. So I imagine that number would go up significantly once they make that jump.
Oh, definitely. I'm excited to see what those numbers are. Like, would we like surpass 90% for a full capacity electric bus? That would be so cool.
That would be amazing.
So stay tuned, everyone. We'll have an episode on that later on. All right. So you just mentioned electric buses. And I know there's like this new system called Bus Rapid Transit, or BRT.
Yes.
That has kind of like, it's becoming so popular. And I was really digging into this, and BRT is like the coolest thing ever. And like, I mean, you work in transportation every day. I don't. So when I saw this, I was like, well, what? We need to get BRT here in Sun Prairie. But for anyone listening who doesn't know what BRT is, could you kind of fill us in on like what it is, how does it work, and how is it different from like a traditional bus?
Sure, absolutely. And I think maybe common misconception that we have here in Sun Prairie, and a question I get a lot is, well, wait, we have service to Madison. Isn't Bus Rapid Transit already here? Well, no, it's not. What we have right now and what exists across Madison is just a typical bus system, which of course are those typical 40-foot buses that follow a fixed route, and they stop and pick up people roughly every quarter mile or less wherever there happens to be a bus stop. What we have here with Bus Rapid Transit is a fundamentally different form of public transportation. The best way to think of this is that this is really light rail that you see in a bigger city, but without the rail. This happens to be the largest grant project that Madison has done in its entire history, and it's not.
Wow.
And frankly, very little of that money is actually going to the large 60-foot buses. Why it is so important is because the major roads in Madison, like East Wash and Mineral Point and University, those are all being reconfigured to have special transit signals and special transit lanes, so that when a bus, for example, is going through rush hour, it has a different signal than the rest of traffic does. So there'll be instances where traffic is at a red light, but a bus will continue to go through its own lane, through that green light. So whereas a bus right now driving the same route as a car is probably going a bit slower because it has to stop and pick up people and such, this is actually competitive with a car driving at the same route. So in terms of your commute time, this is a real game changer. Mm-hmm. For example, these buses are 60 foot long as opposed to 40, and they're articulated. So kind of what people might think of, for lack of other ways to say, those like bendy buses that you see in bigger cities,
right,
like the Twin Cities and Chicago and such. That's something that's going to be existing here as well. So again, these are buses that are able to bypass traffic and really operate as its own form of transportation. And the exciting thing is that it begins here at its eastern terminus at Sun Prairie.
Okay, so we're going to have this soon, and we're talking bigger buses, possibly electric, designated lanes,
definitely electric,
able to reach destinations possibly quicker than our personal vehicles. This is huge, because I know a big reason why some people won't take the bus. They'll say, oh, I totally would take the bus, but it's going to increase my commute time by 20 minutes. And then that's like what turns them away from it, because we're kind of driven by convenience in this society. So I think this is huge, and I'm so happy this is coming to Sun Prairie. So a question for you is, in Madison, I've actually seen some bus stops that appear to be out of place, like in the median, as opposed to traditionally on the side of the road, like where the sidewalk is. Are those for BRT?
They are for BRT. Yeah, and thank you for asking that. We get that a lot. So BRT stops are roughly about every half mile. Again, these stops are somewhat less frequent to help make the service rapid. And these stations, they have roofs on them. They have heated concrete, obviously, to an extent, so that you can be in a sheltered environment and not have to stand in the snow. And you can even purchase passes at the station. There'll be those kiosks there where people can do that before boarding the bus. Now, like a common question I think that you're alluding to is like, well, why are some of these stops in the road? Are people going to have to, walk into East Wash to get on the bus? Well, no, these buses have doors on both sides.
Oh, okay.
And sometimes to make room for these stations. So, like, for example, a few places on East Washington Avenue, there's just really isn't space to build that type of station with all those amenities on the side of the road. And where that space exists in the median, where currently some of those garden plantings and concrete exists, there's room there to put those stations. So that works perfectly seamlessly in a whole litany of other cities where bus rapid transit already exists. So that's not some sort of experiment. That's a proven measure that exists that we're just transferring here to the Madison area.
Okay, got it. This is sounding more and more like a subway station or like light rail, like you said, where you have those stops on both sides of the track or the lane.
It functionally works the same way as light rail. It's just a different kind of infrastructure.
So, Alexander, I've been so interested in BRT, and I guess like my big question was, I was like, okay, how are these buses able to travel faster than cars or get to a destination quicker? So I was like really digging into this because I wanted to understand how it worked. And I did some digging and I found that there's actually communication that occurs between the buses and the traffic signals, which is why they're able to pass through intersections when a vehicle might be stopped. So I found that there's both a passive option and an active option when you're implementing BRT with the traffic signals. And what I found is that if you choose to implement the passive option, it doesn't solely benefit the transit line, but rather it improves the traffic flow for all vehicles on the route. So what it will do is it will create like a green wave of just like continuous green lights so that the BRT can keep traveling through those without stopping. And of course, vehicles will be able to as well. That's the passive option. And honestly, like even just this basic passive option, it sounds great to me because where I grew up in Detroit, there's this famous highway called Woodward. And since I drove on it so much, I eventually learned that if I set my cruise control at 45 miles per hour, which is exactly the speed limit, I can get through green lights for 10 to 15 miles and never stop. I don't think we have a huge transit on that road, but I think that kind of demonstrates that green wave and how it benefits all drivers on the road. It's a win-win.
Certainly.
Now, the active option that I learned about is more complicated to set up, but it will greatly improve the flow of traffic solely for the buses. So active will only benefit buses, and then cars will be left in the dust. So in this option, the buses are set up with transmitters that are able to communicate with the traffic signal by a series of receivers and signal controllers. So with the setup, the traffic signals are actually able to detect a bus approaching and then change their signal accordingly. So I found that there's 4 main types of signal prioritization with the active option. Do you mind if I tell you about them?
Oh, please do. I'm interested.
I'm just like geeking out about this. So the first one is there's something called a green extension. So if a traffic signal is green and it detects that a bus is approaching, it will actually extend the green light long enough so the bus can pass through the intersection. Now, if the traffic signal is red, but it senses a bus approaching, it will shorten the red light so that the signal is green by the time the bus arrives. That second option is called early green. So again, prioritizing the bus. Another common signal for BRT is an early red. So if a transit vehicle is approaching an intersection, but it is too far away to make the current green light, even with an extension, the signal will switch to red early to ensure that it will be green again once the bus reaches the intersection. So that's those are the 3 main ones I found. And then the last one is just about setting up the phases of the traffic signals differently. So for example, let's say the light typically is green, and then after the green light, it has a green left turn. It might actually rearrange the signals if it would benefit the bus. So if the bus is approaching and it's going to turn left, it will actually show the green arrow first before showing the green light for continuing forward. So it can rearrange signals. So I thought, yeah, I was super fascinated with this. I totally geeked out. And I'm recalling that there was a traffic class offered at my university, and I wish I would have taken it because I'm sure they cover this and a plethora of other information in it. So I'm sad I didn't sign up for it. Did you happen to take a traffic class? I'm assuming you probably did.
I did. We had to go over into the engineering school for that a bit, so not as much as I'd like to think, but yes, I did.
Oh, I love that. So, what I love about BRT and its communication with the traffic signals is that if you're in a personal vehicle, your commute will actually be dictated by the location of the transit vehicles, because then you might be getting red lights, so it's more convenient for the bus. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And honestly, like, this is how it should be. I think the public transit should be receiving priority, because if we give priority to the more sustainable option and we make it the most convenient option, then we will have more people on board with public transit.
Absolutely.
So what would you say are some of the main benefits to the triple bottom line of sustainability? So society, environment, and economy. What are the benefits of BRT in terms of those three pillars?
Oh, absolutely. So in terms of society and economy, I think we talked a little previously in this episode sort of about economy, sort of about what the savings you can get with transit.
Yeah.
Well, it's like that, but even more exaggerated with bus rapid transit in terms of your commute time, because it is competitive with the car in terms of its timing. I know one study, since I got asked by at least one alder this in the question, just sort of like, how does this really affect ridership? Back when Minneapolis introduced bus rapid transit back in its day, ridership jumped pretty substantially by about 33% based on what the line was right there, which is a really big jump
that's huge.
In terms of when you're talking about a city like Minneapolis. Now, Madison, for a city of its size, really punches above its weight in terms of its ridership along those main lines. Mm-hmm. So I think we'll see really something like that when that takes off here, and in terms of the pocketbook, that will translate to to people's commute times, and their savings. Certainly when we're talking about, how the transit system works here in Sun Prairie with our local buses meeting with the bus rapid transit at the park and ride, there is that real opportunity too for people to, even meet them halfway. You don't necessarily have to take public transit the entire way from your house to downtown. You can, park your car at the park and ride and treat that as a transfer center. You can park your car there for free. Get on the bus and then not have to worry about where you're going to park your car in downtown Madison, which is, I'm not saying anything controversial here when I say it is incredibly expensive, especially if you're working at like the university or something like that. In terms of sustainability, when you have that many more people riding the bus, that's that many more cars not on the road. Mm-hmm. That's that many cars, not in traffic as well. Another way in which you can transfer your modes is also by bicycle too. So if you want to be able to incorporate biking into your commute, but you're just getting into it, that biking from Sun Prairie to Madison, that's a tall order to do every day.
Yeah.
But biking from from your home in Sun Prairie to the park and ride, and then putting your bike on the bus.
Okay.
That is a much more doable feat.
Oh, definitely. On our current transit system, can you bring a bike on board?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, not strictly on board. Each bus has pull-down bike racks on the front of the bus that can fit 2 bicycles each. But functionally, yes.
Gotcha.
That capacity will be expanded with bus rapid transit, though.
Okay, awesome.
Including bike racks at the stations themselves, if that's more appropriate for your situation.
Okay, yeah, I was actually going to ask about that. So you mentioned that kind of our contact point with BRT is going to be our park and ride station. So what type of infrastructure changes can we expect to see at our park and ride as we prepare for BRT?
Absolutely. So right now there is some construction going on down there, and if people are wondering what that is, well, what that is we're building. We're treating that more as more of a transfer center. So there will be restrooms for the drivers there. Of course, there will also be an electric charging station for the bus. The bus rapid transit buses, by the way, are all electric. So that will be a charging station for the bus there at some point.
Okay.
Now in the longer term, and it will be a separate project, but kind of one of these quote-unquote good problems that we've run into is that ever since transit took off in Sun Prairie, usage at the park and ride has really gone up.
Oh,
and it's
great.
become clear to us that we might, reach capacity one of these days in terms of there. So maybe an expansion of the park and ride will be in order at some point, certainly within the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay, I would love to see it. I love when we have like good problems like that in terms of sustainability.
Exactly.
So can you fill us in a little bit more on the city of Madison's BRT plans, because we're being tied into their routes. They're kind of leading this initiative.
So currently the route that the BRT runs exists right now, and you can get there in Sun Prairie. It's the current Madison Route A, and that begins at the Park and Ride and heads down East Washington Avenue until it gets to the square, then heads through the university, heads down Whitney Way, and then down Mineral Point, where it ends on the west side of town, over by Junction Road, so somewhat past West Town Mall. Those stations will be spaced apart every half mile, and this system is going to be launching in less than a year. So Metro is we don't know an exact date yet, but it's going to be late 2024. Okay. So let's say October or such. So that's really that's about 9 to 10 months away. That's really quick.
Yeah, it's coming soon. I'm so excited.
Absolutely. And maybe this is getting off the topic of Sun Prairie, but Madison is already holding a lot of community engagement, is in the planning processes for a second bus rapid transit route. Wow. Not to here in Sun Prairie, but that'll be a north to south route, whereas this one is an east to west route. So that one will be really the same, but connecting from Fitchburg to the north side of Madison as well.
Okay, so really covering a big part of our county.
Certainly of the Madison area, yes.
Okay, that's awesome.
I will just also add that one of the many, many changes that are taking place with Metro Transit this year, when BRT takes off, they are also working right now on making it so that you'll be able to check in with like an app or a credit card with the bus when you get on the bus as well. That's not a capability that exists on the buses right now. Mm-hmm. So with that ease of access to be able to pay your fare rather than having to, have exactly $2 in cash because the drivers can't, break change for you. Right. That'll be something that makes riding the bus that much easier, hopefully, by the end of the year.
For sure, yeah. I feel like I get anxiety, like, trying to make sure I have my money ready before the bus arrives, and then, like, you don't have enough, or you don't have change, and then you, panic, what do I do?
The drivers are friendly, too, but it was an intimidating experience the first couple times I rode the bus as well.
Know. I feel you. So this is going to solve so many problems we currently have with transit.
Exactly.
Okay, so far in this episode, we've heard a lot about public transit and BRT, which has been awesome. But I just want to point out that there are other sustainable transportation options, and we really need a diverse portfolio of transportation options in order to be successful in our fight against climate change and reducing emissions. So, for example, we have rideshare options. We could switch to alternative vehicles such as EVs. We can, of course, bike, walk, rollerblade, whatever it may be. So I guess I'm trying to picture how we can successfully integrate all of these different transportation options into our streets in a way that is safe and benefits the environment. Right now, I feel like a majority of our roads and streets are built solely for personal vehicles. So if you're lucky, sometimes there might be a 5-foot sidewalk on the side of the road, or maybe there is a bike lane on the edge of the road. But these can sometimes be viewed as dangerous depending on the road, or also inconvenient. So can you maybe help us understand what the roads of the future will look like and how we can successfully integrate all of these diverse forms of transportation?
Absolutely. Certainly within transportation dialogue nationally and really internationally at this point is to move to a mode of streets of what we call complete streets. Okay. And complete street, really that really takes from the old school way of thinking, which is just, looking at the road and moving traffic and accommodating traffic flow, to really looking at the entire public right-of-way of the road and talk about all users and how the road can talk about all users. And again, that does include cars. That's not saying we're not thinking about cars or freight, because that is important. But we're also weighing of equal importance to people who are cycling, bicycling, of course, for anyone who lives in the neighborhood and is getting by walking. So thinking about proper pedestrian amenities. Anyone who does happen to be taking the bus. If you want to take it a step further, not just people who are walking, but people with disabilities who have mobility devices. Making sure that you don't just have that sidewalk, but you have an easy environment for someone, for example, in a wheelchair to be able to get around. Right. So that's really, instead of just looking at the pavement, we're talking about looking at the entire roadway and how that really fits in with the land use of the community that road happens to be in. And that's something that we're trying to apply here in Sun Prairie as well.
Okay. So do you feel like with complete streets, is the idea to actually reduce the number of drive lanes and replace them with like a BRT lane or maybe like a bigger designated bike lane? Is that kind of what we see with complete streets?
It can be, but it very much depends on the road. And I think one beautiful thing about this this philosophy here, and I think a really common misconception is that, to some of the naysayers of complete streets, they'll be saying like, oh, well, we're just putting bike lanes where no one's going to be riding their bike anyway, or we're just putting them there pro forma. Well, it's not exactly like that. A complete street can mean something completely different if you're talking about just, a local road here in Sun Prairie that, that just has single-family homes and just has pretty slow traffic versus something that's really more of a freeway-style road, kind of like what we have on, Grand Avenue. So, for example, a complete street on Grand Avenue looks very different. So one thing we have, for example, wide paths there, and we would want to be like having wider pedestrian infrastructure on the side of the road that's removed more from the roadway than you might have in a neighborhood, to not only have that be an area where you can technically walk, but one where it's comfortable to walk.
Right.
Walking right, if you have a sidewalk, that's technically there right along the highway, it's technically safe, but that's, very unpleasant. Mm-hmm. And you can say the same thing, especially about, a bike lane on the side of the road there. You technically do have that dedicated space, but next to 40-mile-per-hour traffic, you might want to have a protected facility there. So when we talk about complete streets in that regard, that's something we want to think of, not to mention transit. Now, of course, on a local road, we're not necessarily putting bike lanes on every single neighborhood street or anything like that. When we're looking at, obviously you want to make sure traffic moves, and you do want to make sure it does move, but we don't want wider lanes than necessary, because wide lanes creates an environment for faster traffic, which is not as friendly or considerate, to your neighbors, literally in a residential setting. And incorporating bikeability in there, might talk more about narrowing the roadway to just what you need to get traffic to move back and forth, but also making sure that it's a shared roadway and that bicyclists can be comfortable sharing the road with traffic. And that can take many forms. For example, that can be speed tables, shared arrow markings within the road, and signage to designate a bike route. So again, it really is context heavy. It depends what road we're talking about. It's not just a formulaic process.
I like that. We have to adapt it to the different areas of our cities.
Exactly.
Going back to the bike lanes, you had mentioned some protective measures for the bikers. What does that look like? Is it ever just like a physical like barrier or like median between like driving lanes and the bike lanes?
It can be. And we don't really have a great equivalent of that in Sun Prairie right now. Kind of the closest what you have is kind of some of that recent construction that we had on Bird Street, where you have a particularly wide 15-foot path. There aren't on-street bike lanes, but there is a much wider 15-foot path, which is different from our 10-foot, because that actually dedicates 5 foot to the pedestrians and dedicates a whole nother 10-foot section to bicyclists as well. So that is in and of itself somewhat of a protected facility. What we see, I think more of what you're referring to is something that we do see in Madison, kind of like what we have in terms of cycle tracks. So, for example, on University Avenue, there is a bike lane that goes the opposite direction of traffic, but there is a concrete barrier that separates the traffic from the bike lane there.
Okay. That probably makes people feel like the most safe, having some sort of barrier.
Exactly. So, of course, that's for a major road like University, but that application, certainly could be applied in other places.
Okay. Do we ever see barriers, and whether it's barriers between the driving lane and the bike lane, or between like the sidewalk and the driving lane, do we ever see barriers that incorporate trees or like green spaces?
Certainly, yeah. So one of the beauties about narrowing the road in a complete street situation is that, we're talking about the entire street. So, of course, the entire public right-of-way. So when you reduce the surface pavement, what you have left is more room for the terrace. And I think this might be something you'd be able to speak to with more expertise than I, but certainly that creates sort of a larger physical barrier between, pedestrians and the roadway. And frankly, just from an economic perspective too, that creates sort of a sense of having, a larger front yard and a more neighborhood feel.
Yeah.
And certainly creating more of those friendlier areas to travel in other ways besides a car is shown to promote property values in terms of your neighborhoods, or when you're applying that to a commercial area, being more walkable does create a more friendly environment that attracts businesses and economic development. So it's really isn't just a transportation benefit, it's a community-wide benefit as well.
Yeah, the triple bottom line.
Exactly.
I guess speaking of that, since we are talking about benefits, could you fill us in on any other benefits you see to the complete streets?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for one, of course, is I think where I sort of got ahead of myself on this question here, right, where we mentioned that, that these complete streets that incorporate all users are shown in the long run to boost property values, to make for more attractive, livable neighborhoods and economic development. But also from a more utilitarian perspective, too, they're also cheaper. So the old school way of thinking is to prioritize traffic flow, which often creates, sometimes unnecessary parking lanes where they're not necessary and wider travel lanes than are necessary. That creates for wider pavement, and pavement is expensive. Pavement is really expensive, not just to build, but to maintain over its entire life cycle. So when you talk about narrowing a particular street by a couple feet to just the amount of width that you have necessary, that might not be that much savings for one particular road, but when you're applying that to your road reconstructions from year to year, that really amounts to millions of dollars of savings, which when we're talking about, you and I are creatures of the public sector, that is huge. That's that many more other projects that we can dedicate that money to, make life better for people of the city of Sun Prairie. There's also, of course, those sustainability benefits, too, where you have that much more green space that are, of course, better for the environment and makes more rooms for tree plantings and such, although I imagine you probably have even more technical expertise you can weigh on that part as well. But it's certainly more environmentally friendly in that regard.
Right, definitely. And I'll get to that in a minute, but I wanted to comment on the fact that, the cost of concrete and building these roads. So I also think that when we're removing more cars off the street, meaning that more people are biking, walking, or taking a BRT system or public transit, then our roads are actually going to last longer because they won't have as much wear and tear on them. So I think that's another big benefit if you're looking at long-term savings for cities to implement complete streets.
Absolutely. We are very heavily focused right now on Vision Zero in the city of Sun Prairie. So Vision Zero meaning 0 deaths or serious injuries as a result of traffic crashes as a goal. And one of the most effective ways to achieve that is through complete streets. So that is really just there is a lot of research that just shows that narrowing a traffic lane, for example, from 11 feet to 10 feet, so just 1 foot, nothing that dramatic, really slows traffic in such a dramatic way where, if the really unfortunate thing happens where a car collides with a person and causes an injury, that 3 or 4 mile per hour difference that car is going might mean life and death for somebody. And of course, we've had some very unfortunate instances of pedestrian deaths here in Sun Prairie. So honestly, even just saving 1 or 2 lives is worth it, if nothing else.
Yeah, definitely. So I did want to move into the environmental benefits. Again, I really took a deep dive into this because I'm so interested in how complete streets can help us achieve a greener future. And one of the first benefits I came across is a big reduction in the heat island effect. So for those who aren't familiar with this, when you have a big concentrated amount of asphalt or concrete, such as on our traditional streets where you just have a wide road followed by sidewalks on either side, you're actually going to experience the heat island effect. So the concrete and the asphalt will actually absorb a lot of the heat coming from the sun, and it could raise the temperature of that local area by up to 7 degrees Fahrenheit, just from that absorption and the heat coming off the pavement. So I'm sure on really hot days, if we're out on a blacktop somewhere, we can feel that heat, especially in parking lots. That is the heat island effect. So the heat island effect can result in compromised human health and comfort, and also increased air pollution levels because of those higher temperatures. Now, with complete streets, there's typically a prioritization for green spaces and trees, like you had mentioned. And trees actually directly combat the heat island effect because they provide shade to surfaces, they deflect the sun's radiation, and they release moisture into the local atmosphere, all of which help to keep the temperature lower. So this is one huge benefit of complete streets that I read into. But also related to this, of course, when you have trees and other plants incorporated into your streets, you'll have automatic carbon sequestration, which will help to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and reduce those local emission levels. And then these green spaces could also become habitat space for our little local animals. And if you do include special plants, you could actually create a habitat for pollinators as well. So we're talking native flowering plants that our local bees can visit. So I think based on all of that and then our discussion of like safety benefits and economic benefits, I truly believe that complete streets do help to advance the triple bottom line of sustainability.
Certainly.
So you had talked about how we have some complete streets here in Sun Prairie. Are there plans currently to add more complete streets?
Certainly. And certainly ever since we completed our active transportation plan, it's really solidified within our city plans that every year whether we're repaving streets or reconstructing streets, it is within the city processes to figure out how can we make these streets complete. As a matter of form, are we making sure that bicyclists can get through, / figuring out the best way that they can be accommodated. Same for pedestrians, while also making sure, of course, that cars can get through and that parking is provided, but being done in a way that is safe, both for the driver, and for residents and for other users besides single occupancy vehicles. And certainly some projects, that happen to be coming up even just in the next year for road reconstruction projects. So, for example, O'Keefe Avenue is being resurfaced next year, and that's being done in a bit more of a complete streets way. And this really goes to show that this doesn't really have to be that heavy-handed an option. So anyone here in Sun Prairie knows that O'Keefe Avenue is very, very wide. As you get to heading north here toward the media center, what currently exists right now are two 14-foot travel lanes for a 25-mile-per-hour road in the roadway, which is excessive for a neighborhood street. A relatively small touch that we're able to do to make this complete is just to get those two lanes down to 11 foot and put on a 6-foot bike lane, which is a very healthy length for a bike lane. Not to mention that we'll be extending the path north, going all the way to Linnerud Drive. And speaking of Linnerud, right out here too, we're also narrowing that roadway to incorporate on-street bike lanes as well, and to improve the pedestrian crossings there as well. Because right now what exists is, while there is technically sidewalk, we don't really have anything in the way of mid-block crossings and such. Okay. We're incorporating that, so just out here where residents can comfortably walk and cross from Sheehan Park to the public library to the aquatic center, and all that. So that's just a couple examples, and we're going to be doing that on from a year-to-year basis. Obviously, depending on the street, it's all going to look different.
Okay, that makes sense. And I feel like sometimes these upgrades of our streets to complete streets aren't too difficult. That's kind of what it sounds like. If it means shortening a lane, that's kind of striping work, right? Mm-hmm. And then adding a bike lane is also striping work. It could be that simple sometimes. Exactly.
And for a more involved project, like with Vandenberg Street, the street's just in very bad condition. It has to be entirely reconstructed. It's going to be narrowed. Mm-hmm. There's going to be more green space. There's going to be less pavement. So it's going to be less expensive to maintain in the long run.
Right.
And not to mention a common drawback as well. Won't that be hard for snowplows? Well, when you create those wider terraces, it also creates more space for snow storage. So anyone who's driving on city streets right now might know that some of that snow is spilling out into the roads a little bit. Mm-hmm. So that plays that additional role here in a northern climate as well.
All right. Alexander, is there anything else you would like to add? I think we're approaching the end of the episode.
Oh, I don't think so. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more coming down the line here. I'm just excited to see what 2024 holds.
All right, we'll have you back in the future. We'll talk about, at that point, we'll have more complete streets. We'll have BRT in place. We'll have electric buses. So we'll be excited to talk about that in the future. But thank you so much for being on the show today. It was a delight chatting with you.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed this. Thank you, Rose.
Yeah, thank you. All right, bye, everyone. Thank you for listening to Sustainable Sun Prairie with your host, Rose Daly. I hope you enjoyed this episode and uncovered something new about sustainability. As always, you can subscribe to our podcast and listen anytime on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and you can listen live on 103.5 FM The Sun, WLSP-LP, and on demand on the Sun Prairie Media Center app. For links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as our contact info, please visit the show notes. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.